Hello, so my name's Lewis, and like many people, I'm sure, I have thought a lot about the zombie apocalypse. Now, as a scientist, I'm interested not only about how would I survive, who would I go with, which of my friends would I ultimately betray, but also what would it look like from a science point of view? What would the public health response be? What would the disease look like? And as a neuroscientist in particular, I've always had a special interest, somewhat ironically perhaps, in the zombies' brains. Now, there's quite a few things that we do understand about brains and brain anatomy, and because of decades of zombie research slash movies, we also understand a bit about what we classically expect as a zombie behaviour. And so we can start actually using that to kind of reverse engineer what the brain would look like. So, Zombie Brain 101. We understand one of the main things is that there is a loss of behaviour, personality, and there's a lot of aggression in zombies, fairly uniformly. And so, the part of the brain that would particularly be interested in would probably be the frontal cortex, which is, not surprisingly, right at the front of the brain. And the cortex is actually the outer bark of the brain itself. Now, the brain's a bit like an onion, so it has layers, and the deeper the layers, if I can open it, the more primal, or from an evolutionary point of view, the older the part of the brain is. And so we're interested perhaps in the parts that we don't control. We have the brainstem, and then it actually goes out into the limbic system. And part of that includes something called the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is probably a part of the brain which is the size of an almond, just in front of your ears, a little bit deep inside. And it's responsible for what we call the 3 Fs. So, fight, flight, and making love. And basically, I've never seen zombies do the last one, except for a very unfortunate Google search once. So, but they certainly do a lot of fight and flight. And the fight, and so the idea is that, well, perhaps this is particularly one of the parts of the brain which would be affected. And what's interesting is that you can think of the frontal cortex as kind of being the controller of the amygdala, in a very basic sense. And so, for example, if there's actually any damage to the frontal cortex, this will stop the inhibition and therefore let aggressive behaviour run wild. And it's actually not uncommon, and it's probably what you also see when you drink a lot of alcohol. And this actually starts basically kind of inhibiting the inhibition. So it actually starts affecting the frontal lobes, and people start getting less inhibited. This is also the part of the brain that develops through adolescence, and you become more and more socially aware and in control of your own behaviour. Now, if they were a spectrum, not that I'm trying to relate adolescence with zombies in any way, but I guess zombies would be a much more extreme end of that spectrum, and so that part of the brain would be probably very, very severely damaged, perhaps by trauma or a virus or parasite or even a prion, and that would have all sorts of implications in terms of identity, personality, and certainly on aggressive behaviour. Now, another part of the brain we could talk about really quickly is that on the left side of the brain, for most people, you have language sensors. And so, for example, you don't really see that many zombies talking, and certainly they don't seem to understand words either. And so I would also imagine that the temporal lobes on the side of the brain would also be very damaged. What's quite cool is that, well, all diseases have slight variations, and so I can use this as a way of explaining the difference between the first generation of zombies, which were much slower and lumbering, compared to the newer generations who are much faster and therefore much scarier in some ways. And the part of the body of the brain that actually affects this for balance or for general movement is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is right at the back of the brain. It looks a little bit like a cauliflower, and it wouldn't be surprising if the first generation would have a lot of damage to the cerebellum, and therefore explains their kind of weird gait and poor coordination, Whereas the newer generation don't seem to have that kind of damage, and so perhaps the disease, whatever it is, has evolved and mutated or developed in a way so it doesn't affect the cerebellum anymore. Now, one of the most difficult parts of zombie behaviour to explain is actually the compulsion to eat flesh, or brains specifically. Now, the part of the brain, or one of the parts of the brain that controls eating and appetite, is the hippocampus, the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, it's quite important in the sense that there are diseases which affect the hypothalamus and cause overeating or sometimes undereating. But why that would actually attach to humans is much more difficult to explain. Now, the only thing I could perhaps suggest is that if you have this loss of social behaviour, loss of inhibition, and an increase of aggression, but then you also have a massive sense of hunger all the time, then maybe this would kind of be represented as eating other people. You know, you're really hungry, you're flashing out at people, and that's what you want to do. Which leads us to my last piece of information, or fact, in which you never really see zombies eat the 5 a day in terms of greens and vegetables. And they do seem to eat a lot of flesh. And so one thought is that perhaps the reason why they're moaning all the time is not because of some primal thing, but actually, you know, not a lot of fibre, a lot of meat. Have you ever seen a zombie poo? So, on that beautiful note, hopefully you won't see zombie movies in the same way ever again. Thanks.